Hey y'all, where you going with that? Circle of tone in your hands. Welcome to Circle of Tone. Today, Jimi Hendrix. This one had me breathing into a brown paper bag because of the insanity of the forums on, I heard you use this, I heard you use that, I read once, I did this, and do you know the lack of evidence for the first few recording sessions that Hendrix had is actually unbelievable. And there is a rumor that Hendrix's most famous songs were actually recorded on a Telecaster. And there's also another sub-rumor where he didn't actually use a Marshall on things like Hey Joe and things like that. So let's get into it. Before I go too far in, thanks to my patrons of Tone, you guys really help this channel out. And if you want to support the channel, keep these speakers flapping, links are below. All right, let's get to the music first. So what I did, I set up a Telecaster, a Marshall, greenbacks from the late 60s, and I tried to mimic as much of his tone as I could. He had little techniques that I can go into here later on. But first of all, let's listen to Purple Haze, because that's the main track that people have contention with. They say that the solo and the overdubs were with a Telecaster, and some people say the rhythm was a Telecaster. And there isn't any concrete proof either way. Let's just listen to my rendition of Purple Haze through a similar setup that he would have had back in the day with a Telecaster, first of all. And we're back. So let's try that same thing with a Stratocaster. So this is going to be in two parts. So I'm going to try some of the solo aspects with the Telecaster and with the Strat in another video. But if you really want to get into the nitty gritty, there are some tracks, isolated tracks of the overdub guitars, not so much the solo and things like that, but overdubs. And on those, you can clearly hear a whammy bar. So, you know, this Fender used to use it a lot on the Fender Strat. And that Telecaster, Noel Redding, who's the bass player, was actually a guitarist. He'd never played bass before until he became the Experience. So people say that he used his Tele, and they have a picture of his Tele, which is supposed Tele, and it didn't have a vibrola on it. It was a hardtail. So there's no way. So there is a Strat on Purple Haze. And there are also first-hand accounts of Hendrix using a Marshall, but that was in Olympic Studios. Okay, when it was actually tracked in two different studios. They did the bones of the the drums, the bass, the guitars. They did the bones in Delane studio, and that is a mysterious little studio. All sorts of hits come out of that, from Queen to the Animals. That's Chas Chandler, actually was the bass player of the Animals, and he's the one that discovered Hendrix. Well, it was technically I think it was a girlfriend of one of the Rolling Stones that actually, I think, turned him onto it. But Chas Chandler is the main one that grabbed him and said, "Hey, you're mine. We're gonna, create amazing music together." And on the session, the first ever session that they had, and Jimi Hendrix had bought 2 Marshall stacks then, 2 full stacks. So he did buy those like a couple of months in advance of this session, okay, in Delane Studios. It was called Delane Lear Studios. So that, timeline-wise, does link up with the Marshalls. But I read an interview with Chas Chandler where he claimed that they got into a massive fight because of the Marshall in that recording session. And he said it was so loud, the Marshall was so loud, that there was a bank above them, and the I don't know if it was the radio frequencies or something, it was jamming the drain. It was jamming the bank systems. They had a primitive bank, computerized systems above them, the first initial versions of that. And it was messing up the bank every time he was playing for this Marshall. But it wasn't just that. Chas Chandler claimed that the fight got so heated that he was too loud for this Marshall, and it wasn't clean enough for Hey Joe. And because that was the first song that he ever put out. And then to follow up Hey Joe, they went to Purple Haze. So I have a theory that Jimi Hendrix may have used a Fender amp on the rhythm section of Purple Haze and on whatever they captured in Delane Lear Studios. That could very well have been a Fender amp. And the reason I say that is because they did have the argument about the Marshall. And it's super clean. Hey Joe is super clean. But I hear on Purple Haze, I hear not plate reverb. There is plate reverb on it, but I also hear spring reverb. And to my knowledge, his Marshalls didn't have spring reverb. So unless they had a spring reverb, because you can tell the difference between spring reverb and plate reverb. It's there's very specific. It sounds a bit nastier, the spring reverb. So not only am I not convinced that it was Marshall and Strat, in my opinion, he did use Marshalls, because Eddie Kramer said, when he first met Jimmy on the first day, his roadie was lugging in these huge Marshalls. So there's a reference to the Marshalls there. And Eddie Kramer let him get away with more than say Chas Chandler did. So, he's probably did have the Marshall on Purple Haze. But I think the initial tracks may have been a Fender, because, they might have used the same setup that they use on Hey Joe. Because Purple Haze, unlike Hey Joe, which took forever to record, it only took them 4 hours to do that initial track. And then they went and sprinkled fairy dust on it with Eddie Kramer. So Eddie Kramer wasn't really big on those first two. He does bring up Purple Haze as the first time he met him. But that was really for overdubs. I'm not even sure the solo was done there. I think the solo might have even been done at Delane Lear Studios. Because there was this effects track is the one that made me convinced that is a Stratocaster because of the dive bombs. So I've been down a rabbit hole on this one. And there are timelines as well, because Noel Redding actually kept a diary of when the Telecaster was mentioned and loaned to him. And that timeline could line up with ironically, the Olympic sessions, where I don't think it was used because of the whammy bar. So I am like, and in the hands, I think the Telecaster sounds more like it. I might even have the wrong amp. He might have used a Fender. So that's it. So this is still a mystery to me. In the hands, it feels that, especially the solo, the down on the, you haven't heard that yet. It sounds like a Telecaster, man. But then the overdubs are obviously the Strat. So I don't know. maybe we can use this like a think tank, because the AC/DC video I did was a big help because there was lots of great suggestions. So if you have proof either way that, you know, the Delane Lear studio stuff, don't worry about the Eddie Kramer stuff. That was probably a Marshall, but then again, the spring reverb is on there. Mysteries. That's why I love this stuff, right? And so I think I got close. The big thing that I messed up with, really, in my chain is the fuzz face. I didn't have the right type of fuzz face, so that sullied my results. What he would do with a Strat when he was using the fuzz face, because he had his Marshall so loud, there's no way you can have the Marshall loud and this fuzz face on settings which are pretty high. So what he would do is he would turn down the volume on his Strat, and that would kind of change the whole tone of fuzz face. Because when I first started using this, I was like, this is a piece of crap. There's no way that this sounds legitimate. But then when I dug a bit deeper, I saw a few good videos on how Hendrix would get his tone, and he did roll off the volume a lot in tandem with the fuzz face. So I would if somebody's local in Florida and they have an old arbiter, you know, an old style germanium fuzz face instead of the silicone fuzz face that I used, I think we will get closer. But that's for another video. It's a cry for help. What do you think? Do you think there was a Telecaster on Purple Haze? Do you think it was I don't think it was a Telecaster on Hey Joe. I think that was a Fender. It kind of sounds obvious. I don't think it is a Fender amp. It could be the plexi just set to normal levels, because Chas Chandler won that argument with Hendrix. And when I say won the argument, he was in the process of actually dealing with immigration issues with Hendrix because he was overrunning on his visa. So he's actually, that day of the Hendrix sessions, he had to go to the embassy to try and extend his visa for 3 months. And so he hadn't done it yet. And Chas Chandler just slammed the papers on the desk in the studio. This is all over Marshall, by the way, which is great, you know. So he slammed the immigration papers on, said, go on then, piss off. And Hendrix just laughed at him, said, okay, you call my bluff. And then obviously turned down the Marshall or used a different amp. Because the Marshall was a huge issue in that first recording session with Chas Chandler and Delane Lear Studios and Hendrix. So, you know, intrigue, right? But in that interview, Chas didn't say that he used a Fender, but that was in all of the studios back then. So yeah, it's an intriguing thing where there's been a book written on the Telecaster. So if anybody has read that book on the supposed Telecaster that Hendrix used on Purple Haze, so you might have more information on it, on the dates and such. But I don't know. So you know, usually I can say yes for sure if I suspected something. So interesting subject on one of the most important songs in rock history, and nobody really knows what was used on those initial tracks because there's no decent pictures from Delane Lear Studios. There are a few of him actually with a Strat in that. So, you know, like I say, Hey Joe sounds like a Strat anyway. It's got that obvious chime to it. So it's not tighter like a Telecaster, you know. And if you use a neck pickup on Telecaster, I think that would be just a little bit different. There's a huge tonal shift compared to a Strat. So lots to talk about. Let me know in the comments. What do you think? An issue I run up against with mine, because Hendrix used to use things like long curly cables, and what they would do, you'd like the cheaper cables that would knock down the treble, because cables don't do anything to tone, you know, it's not like any effect. But what it does is it can reduce certain frequencies when they're cheap long cables, you know, capacitance. So if you have a scratchy Telecaster, so I would have, you know, I did use longer cables, but he was going to tape, he was going through old mixing desks, and that knocks down a lot of the treble as well. So when I was recording to digital, even though I did try, you can't see it out of shot, there's some pictures on my Instagram of mic positions, the microphones I used. I mixed a ribbon mic with a Newman style large diaphragm. condenser, and I did put it through a 1073 style preamp, and I actually with EQ as well. But even then, it was still a little bit sharp because, recording to tape, it's a lossy format. So if you recorded Hendrix today with an SM57 in front of an old 60s greenback with digital, with a pristine, hear everything, no noise floor of digital, it would take the enamel off your teeth. That thing would be sharp. Single coils with a Marshall and greenbacks, forget about it. I'm actually going to do a video on this where it's like, is everything that we have been told wrong? Because these old classic mics and these old like SM57s, things like that, I didn't use that on this, but we were copying from the big guys in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they were recording to tape. So is recording to tape, they had muffled audio back then relative to what we have now. So the mics that they were choosing, were they sharp sounding? And now in digital, where it's like, rock music is kind of taking a tumble in popularity. And is it because we're using the wrong mics? So there's a lot to be said about the pluses and minuses of modern recording. And it should all be pluses. But if we can start thinking about different mics and different approaches, because what we have now is a failed model, because nobody's listening to new rock and new metal, they relatively to the old ways. So that is a subject for another day. And I don't think you can overemphasize how important Chas Chandler was. I mean, he actually overheard Hendrix just messing around with the riffs of Purple Haze before it was even a song, and he took him to the side and said, you have to finish that song because that's going to be the next single. I can hear it. And that's what he was. He was I would have liked to have known an alternate reality where they didn't have a fallout, and the fallout was mostly because of the rock star aspect, where Hendrix would have about 20 friends and women and hangers-on in the studio with him, and it would drive Chas nuts because he was all there to work. He was all business. So I think that might have been a blessing and a curse, because Eddie Kramer were kind of okay all of that. Maybe he needed a stronger figure in his life to keep him, but then again, you never know. I mean, was his greater work after Purple Haze and Hey Joe? And it's up there. He recorded some amazing stuff after that. But yeah, it's a sad story, but it's an epic story, and that's rock and roll, right? So yeah, I'll go into more detail on the solo aspect, where he was using octavers and fuzz faces and other boosts. They would actually change chips and all sorts of things on the fly, just trying to get sounds, with Roger Myers. But I'll get into that in the solo. This one is, I want to concentrate more on the Telecaster aspect of it, and the did he or didn't he. So it's a mystery, right? But yeah, we can get into more of that. They did all sorts of little effects and tricks, including putting headphones on microphones and things like that. So we can get into that another time. But just to go through what I used this is a supposedly Japanese Fender Strat. It's the old 3-way switch one. The output I would have liked to have used. I'm not sure. I think I used the rosewood fretboard, so mine might be again because it was a bit sharper than his. That might have been the issue. So, and also then I used this, which is my Pinecaster, which I made myself. A few different things. It does have vintage style bridge, and it does have vintage pickups in it and electronics, Fender pickups and Fender tuners, but it has a brass nut, so that could affect it a little bit. I had tuning issues. This sounds better than this. When you tune to the album, like I did, don't listen to the Purple Haze on YouTube, because that's not the album version. It's actually tuned down, and that's obviously a Marshall because you can see what he's using. It's a live version. So if you want to way beat them, obviously go from the original album. version, which is standard-ish. I think it's slightly lower than standard because either tape speeds not being calibrated or just them winging it, you know, tuning by ear. This I managed to tune into it with this. I couldn't tune to standard E because that was slightly off. So this, don't listen to the I play it better on this, and I'm slightly out of tune on this. So don't let that sway you, because this is going to sound better. So you might think that this is it. Just listen to it tonally compared to the other one, and maybe you can help me out as well with this mystery. All right, chaps, you've been great. Like I say, my own brand pickups are out. Here's a quick sound clip of my pickups. So you can pick them up at circulartone.com, or you can just to help out the channel, because you know it is struggling a little bit with PayPal donations, things like that. Circulartone.com, and also we have a Facebook group. So if you like talking about these type of things, just search Circle of Tone in Facebook and come join us. We're over 1,000 strong. All right, chaps, you've been great. See you next time. Circle of Tone.